Well, good day. As I sit here waiting for the plumber, I thought I'd get off a short little recording. I'm currently trying to figure out what would be the most important piece of work I should write next. Whether it's on the I Ching or Nietzsche's Zarathustra or Carl Jung's alchemy or his I Ching use, his active imagination, or synchronicity in Joyce, in Nietzsche, and in Camus. But that's a separate. That's actually I'm going to try going live this afternoon on YouTube if you're around. It's just Al Ohm on YouTube. It was Almighty Ohm. I don't know if it's still listed as both. This weekend was awesome. It was the first class of our the quiescence of Trika Shaivism. It's with a wonderful professor. His name is Timosina. He's San Diego State University. I always mix it up. I think it's San Diego State University, but he's taught all over. And currently this is through Weimarsha. Weimarsha is very interesting because that's what the fourth class was this past weekend on Sunday. It was about Weimarsha, or more specifically, reflexiveness. Reflexivity. Not reflectivity, but reflexivity. And so we went through talking about this, and essentially reflexivity is the self and the nature of reality, the nature of objects itself, and our relationship to them. I guess here I'll read what I wrote as a summary of about 10 or 12 pages of notes that I made from this past weekend. So I said, we attach to being or self as a totality, and the same could be said of reality. But it is this same attachment to the self that is the very limit of our perception, of our understanding, and of our potential. Our true, the non-self, our true totality is infinity, like the Conan movie, My Little Joke, right? But limitless potential, without limits. Right? This is this idea. And it's interesting, too, because he mentioned Descartes, right? Cogito, I think, therefore I am. He mentioned Martin Buber's I and Thou. This class was what made me realize that I have actually achieved what I've been seeking to do. Kind of like a modern philology. I call it neoclassic or neoclassic classical philology, where not seeing one philosophy as different in East or West as when I first went to school. My school had very little on Eastern philosophy, lots on the Western. But even then, classical versus Western versus Eastern, I argue we need to stop applying these labels. In fact, on my walk this morning, I realized, like Camus or Nietzsche, the idea here is to be a rebel in a world that is defined solely by labels. To be a rebel, truly be free, is to be undefinable by those labels. Or, one step deeper, is that you are defined by your indefinability, right? I know it sounds silly, but it's just the idea of when you are at a state where you can't be defined, right? Like the example I was thinking on the walk is I've spent 35 years studying the I Ching, but also 35 years studying Nietzsche, but also 35 years studying Tantric Buddhism, also 35 years doing a million other different things. So you could call me an outdoorsman, an environmentalist, a humanist, a Tantric Buddhist, a philosopher, a philologist, a human, a person. Everything falls to these labels that leave us wanting for more context, more understanding. And so I thought it was one of the best classes I've had, because at the beginning of this class, he said he makes no apologies for using advanced Sanskrit terms, because there's no better way of getting across these ideas. But this is what I love, is that I know these words. And as example, this morning, just getting ready to send the wife off to work, I clicked on a video that was learn Greek, classical Greek, right, pre-1400 and some. And they were using, I think, Gospel of John, which isn't weird, right? Because it's very old Greek, and it's got a lot of scholarship behind it. But what I found funny is one of the words that was highlighted. The author said, "Well, this is a really difficult word because context, it's hard to define in English." And no, it's not really hard to define. I mean, surely it's hard to use one word, as many are. This is why philologists love etymology, and why we love language, is because it allows us to see into this myth, into this meaning. As I've said, I've heard linguists talk about that the Eastern languages, Sino-Japanese as example, don't have the same myth and what? Are you kidding me? It's all myth and allegory. The characters themselves are essentially myth and symbols at once, right? So the big takeaway for me is modern philosophy doesn't need to discount one to raise another. It's what we need to realize, like I realized recently, that arguably, as Northrop Frye and Joseph Campbell state, that most of the Western canon requires the Bible to understand. I argue with the influence of the Upanishads and many of these other Eastern philosophies having such a tremendous influence on some of my favorite writers, Buber, Nietzsche, Schopenhauer, but even deeper than that, I mean, we can see it resonate in so many other philosophies. But even in Camus, I think the reason why Camus is a rebel, and this is what people miss, they say that he was a classicist in a time when we have moved away from it. But if you listen to Camus, I highly recommend his Myth of Sisyphus, you'll get from him that he's not arguing for us to go back to a classical view. He's arguing that we've thrown the baby out with the bathwater. As he says, Nietzsche told us that if God is dead, then what do we believe? Right? So it's not faith that we're discussing, it's meaning, it's understanding, it's language, it's culture, it's our telos, our telemetry. Which way are we going? What do we do? Why? Right? And as I said, Camus will as easily, I love it too, because he says the aridity, and then he mentions Shakyamuni in the desert. I think that is so beautiful, right? Because the aridity of the soul that he's mentioning is Saint Juan of the Cross and his obscure night of the soul. And then Shakyamuni of the Shakyamuni clan is Buddha in the desert. Deserts like the Desert Fathers. But it's also an allegory in the Chinese Book of Change, the I Ching, that to climb great mountains, crossing great rivers, like these monomyths, right? We can criticize Joseph Campbell for not having adequate scholarship, but as he clearly defined, and we'll see it even more since, when we have endless examples, like the flood myth is a common one, right? Almost every culture has something like that. The example I give is the myth of the great cow, great mother, her udders feeding all of Gaia and mankind, all of the earth and people both. But do we really need to prove? That's arguably what Camus was talking about. If we spend our lives desperate for proof alone, then we're going to spend our lives desperate and alone. Because meaning is found in the I and the other relationship, not the I and the it, because it doesn't have this spirit that Shaivism talks about, this Vaimarsha. So an object, when you see it as an other, you use your own I-ness to embody another object. And if you embody that other object as I've said many times before, as explained in the Ishu Upanishad, the sixth line where it says that you must see the self in the other and see the other in the self. This is no different than Vaimarsha in Shaivism, in Trika Shaivism, is when you see an object, you externalize yourself, same as Marshall McLuhan was talking about. We externalize ourselves, Schopenhauer talked about it as well. We embody the object to understand what it is, and it is kind of like the via negativo, this idea of a negative when I'm not. But the way the Shaivists see it is, it's not negative, it's a positive sense. What you're doing is you're embodying the other to experience them. And when this Vaimarsha, this reflexivity happens, you externalize yourself and the self comes back as the object. And there's this interesting event, and I love how he compared it. He compared it to fire, how fire consumes even itself. And so he says this Vaimarsha is like an all-consuming fire of the self, and that the self will even consume itself. Right? As a fire runs out of oxygen or fuel, as the self, right? If you think about it, this is what Nietzsche was talking about, and no doubt might have been influenced by the same philosophies. He spoke on, if we were alone in the woods with nobody around to speak to, and he argues as a thought experiment, would we have need of language? And if we didn't, would we lose the use of language? And what might that risk as far as our being, our consciousness? Right? And that's the argument. We're so afraid that emptying this configuration file of preferences that we call the self, it's called the storehouse in Sanskrit, the Alaya Vijnana, the storehouse of these seeds of consciousness. I was, a kid that grew up and liked playing lacrosse, and my favorite color is blue, and I like rock and roll, all this sort of stuff. I don't like Brussels sprouts, I do like this and that. All of these preferences are strictly that. And what we're afraid of is when we let go of these preferences, if we truly do admit that the self is a construct and there is nothing there to hold on to, then letting go of simply this attachment to the self doesn't delimit us in the sense it doesn't delimit us in the sense what we're afraid of. It doesn't delimit us in the sense that we're no longer going to have the power to do anything, right? We think that this self is what propels us, but it's not. It's not. And even in Nietzsche's Willenmacht, this will to power, goes back to Schopenhauer, right? It's not the self that is the will, right? The being, the telos, the motion, the momentum, the action of the being is the true manifestation, not the shadow, right? And so, I digress. I apologize about that, but so I thought it was absolutely beautiful. It was talking about this in Sanskrit. It's Purna Ahanta. It's this complete I-ness, right? This codependent projection of the self and the world. And it's interesting because I was listening to a scholar. He uploaded an hour-long video on Vajrayana, and sadly he's so often missed, even with someone with a PhD in Buddhism. He also misunderstands this very simple idea that there is no separation between the self and the other, this codependent reflexivity of experience. What he was talking about is he's got a PhD in the same area that I specialize in, Yogacara, Madhyamaka. And he mentioned that his area of specialty, and this was his thesis, he was arguing for the correct position that Yogacaras hold when it comes to the reality of existence versus the Madhyamakan position where, reality, conventional reality, all this stuff doesn't actually exist. But what's interesting is they're both right and they're both wrong. I've actually done a podcast on this before. It's called the Prasangika. Doesn't matter. It's just this satir. It's just an argument back and forth. Is conventional reality real? Is it not? The real takeaway here is it is and it isn't. Right? Conventional reality is real, as the Yogacara says, because we have to interact with it. I mean, it's here. The self, we attach to it. Whether it's a construct or not, we still give it birth as an object. Everything is an object. But the Madhyamakans are right because we don't perceive the world the way it truly is because we're such a limited being. Right? As I said, attachment to the self automatically makes us a very finite being, very limited, very ephemeral, right? So we're trapped within our own prison, as it were, we're our own jail. So they're both right? Conventional reality, the mind, dharma, it's existent, but at the same time it's not as we know it, and we may never be able to experience it, right? So I find it interesting that is the next level to this understanding. I think, as Nietzsche said, and again, something I spoke about on my walk, I think my forte here is that I don't see a demarcation between these philosophies, and so many people do. I think the big difference here is to be able to see this universality of truth, this understanding of the nature of reality, the nature of self, because I think it can inform us for trauma. It can inform, your Buddhists, your Christians. It can heal people. It can help with our identity, our disenfranchisement from each other and our organizations and our belief systems and our histories. But it could move forward science and philosophy. Most importantly, some of these movements towards artificial intelligence and maybe learning algorithms. I mean, this can teach a lot if you go back. And I found this interesting because I was watching a seminar on, what was his name? I can't remember his name off the top of my head. But he's also a practitioner. He calls himself a neuro-yogacaran. And yet, in an entire discussion about the nature of self and artificial intelligence and the nature of existence and being, never once he mentioned Vasubandhu. He's even done a research paper on Vasubandhu, a really famous Yogacaran. But he forgot to mention the importance of his philosophy of upakara, right? The self. The nature of self is something that's handy, something that's close at hand, because we need it. It's not something that's pre-existing. It's not something that is going to continue to exist. The example I give is if you get something stuck in your shoe when you're out for a walk, you'll very often pick up a stick to scrape out the mud or whatever it may be gets stuck in your shoe. But you're not going to continue to carry that stick for the remainder of your life as your shoe cleaning stick. You'll just cast it aside and move along because you understand the need going forward. And that's the Yogacara understanding of what the nature of self is. The nature of self is not a stick that we carry with us throughout our life. The nature of self is a stick that we find thereabout, upakara, and we use to our needs, arguably not that different from, who would have explained this? I mean, Bertrand Russell, Schopenhauer, just how to come about to understand the nature of reality. You can't understand everything, can't be prepared for everything. You know, you have to. Jung talked about this, the nature of logic, of reasoning, of understanding, of learning, and then the final piece, this induction, right? This eureka. It's knowledge from the ether. Where does this come from? It's anumana in Sanskrit, phronesis in Greek. For the life of me, the Latin word just won't come to me. That's what you get when you take Latin 30 years ago and start learning all these other ones. You begin to forget. I make jokes and say that I've forgotten more about some subjects than many others may learn, but that's just a play on Nietzsche's joke about that he's able to say more in a sentence than many authors struggle to say in a book. But I think it's not unlike Hemingway, who said true gauge of an author is what he leaves out. And as he says as well in A Movable Feast, Hemingway, that more tangible to a reader are the things that you leave unsaid on the page, right? More rich and vivid and lasting, and I mean, the example I give is both the poem and the science fiction story by Ray Bradbury. Sarah, the last name of the young lady escapes me. The lady wrote the poem. Her name is Sarah. The science fiction story is of the same name as the poem. It's by Ray Bradbury. It's a very short poem. It's only about, a short poem, but also a short story. About 5 pages for the story, 6 stanzas for the poem. And I believe, don't quote me on this, I believe the poem dates back to the 19th century. Ray Bradbury, I think the story is 1965 or 63. The poem is entitled "And a Gentle Rain Will Fall." What a beautiful poem. The story and the poem both make use of not just poetic devices and visual devices, but what's not said is the most powerful in both, which is metamodernism, which is what we're meant to see when it comes to this Weimarische reflexivity, true nature of self, true nature of permanence. All of our realizations come down to this simple truth, that the answer is 42. Our goal is to discover the question, because only the individual can figure out the question to their being, their everything, their meaning, their value. Right? So, all right. My apologies on that. Yes, so I was just mentioning that the science fiction story by Ray Bradbury, "And a Gentle Rain Will Fall," and the poem itself, which is a part of the short story, actually get all of their what's the word? Their impact from what's not said on the page. And "A Gentle Rain Will Fall" is about it's about the First World War and the horrors of the same. I've mentioned this before, that Carl Jung's Red Book came out of the nightmares that he saw in the First World War. Right, Hemingway was traumatized tremendously, but his artwork grew out of this same experience of trauma. But the poem is about what may or may not come. And the science fiction short story is about what may or may not come. But in this story, it posits a possible potential for our being So in the story, it's about a house, an automated house that just carries on all by its lonesome. Just the futility as well as the pathos of that alone. But in the end of the story, all that's left is just a single wall of a collapsed house, just repeating the date and time to nobody. Right? So the story itself just mentions, dawn, the remains of a house, just one wall still standing. From that wall, I guess, like a computer generated voice repeats the day and the time to nobody. There's nobody and nothing left. So the truth of that, when it's too late. So that's why I thought it was beautiful, that finally we're starting to see a synergy of understanding between these different, as I said, this is a class for advanced level, Sanskrit or Nawari or Buddhist, Shaivist, Hindu scholar, I'm not sure who'd want to be learning about Trika Shaivism, besides a practitioner, obviously. Me, I said I found it resonated because my professor was told that he as a Shaivist, because he couldn't find a guru, he was told to follow a Vedantin practitioner, and that's who his guru was. So again, I think it's not that weird for me to hear the resonance in the teachings as a tantric practitioner, but also as a unique type of tantric practitioner, as I've said. So as a final thought, I was so incredibly moved by the class that I wrote a couple little poems, silly as they may be, that I might share them. So the first one I just entitled Burn. Agni burns Alaya, leaving in the ashes Amala. So burn away. Again, this comparison, right, to nirvana. Nirvana being a Sanskrit word to snuff out a flame. And as I said, this Vimarsha, this reflexivity of the self, is like a fire. Once it burns out, right? So Agni is the ultimate guru. The guru of fire burns away the self, right? So Agni burns the alaya, the storehouse of the self, leaving in the ashes Amala, perfection, right? Which is the nature of self, nature of Trika practice and their goal, but don't quote me on that. And the next poem, no title, I just wrote, A storehouse burns, leaving the remains, ashes for egos, traded subjects for objects, seeing the forest of we as I.